Hello, internet friends, Tama here. I have some kind of eye issue today where my eye is super swollen and painful, so I'm not wearing makeup and I'm wearing my glasses, so I'm gonna look a little different. Hopefully nobody minds. Welcome to your November bonus video, everyone. Today the topic that my patrons have picked on Patreon is what makes each Pokemon generation special. So this is a fairly easy topic, I think. It was able to write quite a bit in my outline, and an equal amount for most generations. The only one that I didn't write that much for is the current generation, Generation 9, because it's not over yet. So we're not entirely sure yet what makes it special. We could be surprised. Let's get right into it. So starting with Generation 1, obviously the Generation 1 games laid the groundwork for the rest of the franchise. Without the Generation 1 games, there would be no rest of the generations. So basically all of the main components of Pokemon gameplay were established here. The elemental typings, having advantages and disadvantages against other typings, multiple team members, and over 100 options for possible team members. The environmental storytelling, where the region plays a big role in communicating the themes and message of the game. And it started off with the region based on a real place, and that happened to be the place where the developers were from and where the game was made. So Pokemon Gen 1 actually came out at the tail end of a JRPG craze in Japan. In the 80s, JRPGs exploded in popularity, and that persisted up through the 90s, up through the mid-90s, I should say. And really, Pokemon kind of came out at the very end of all of that. I would say the late 90s is kind of the cutoff point for that really popular period in Japan of JRPG games, starting with Dragon Quest. So Dragon Quest is kind of the originator, and if you want to go back further, there's tabletop RPGs and strategy RPGs. Text-based RPGs, I wonder if those were as popular in Japan. But Dragon Quest really captured the public's imagination, and then after JRPGs became so popular, a lot of the games started doing JRPG but with a twist kind of concept. So we had Earthbound, which on the NES started as a concept of what if Dragon Quest but in a suburb? What if Dragon Quest but the enemies were like normal, everyday things you came across, and all the items were everyday household items? Basically, the twist was just, what if you took all of the fantasy out of this fantasy genre? What would it be like? And Earthbound was largely popular. A lot of those people went on to be part of Creatures, who developed Pokemon, and Pokemon is in the same vein, where it is a modern-day RPG that takes place in not exactly like Earthbound, not exactly the real world, but a fantasy version of the real world that takes place in modernity. And what Pokemon managed to do, which is to innovate in a genre that was so saturated to the point where even subversions of the expectations of the genre of RPGs were becoming very common, they managed to innovate anyway and stand out in a pretty saturated genre. And they, at the tail end of a fad, managed to become insanely popular and become sort of like a new craze all on their own. So they built something enduring. And add on to that the system itself, the Game Boy, was already quite old at that point. By the time Pokemon came out, especially by the time Pokemon was localized around the world, the Game Boy was already almost 10 years old. It is truly an impressive game, and I think, Pokemania has been well documented, but I don't think that everybody always gets the full scope of its enormous success, and that it really was kind of an unexpected success as well. To me, what makes Gen 1 special is also its simplicity. It's a very nice game to return to these days because of its size and simplicity compared to modern Pokemon games and other Pokemon games that are not so modern but more complicated. Sometimes the limitations that it imposes by being so bare bones compared to all the other features that get added later is that it's really quick and approachable in that way. If you wanted to do some kind of a challenge run or a self-imposed rule set run where you replay the game, it's not an overwhelming task. It feels firmly doable, and you have kind of a lot of ways to pull it off, sort of inadvertently, because the game is riddled with holes. So for me, I think Gen 1 really is special, and even though it takes place in Kanto, and Kanto has been so revisited, it is still my favorite version of Kanto, which is maybe maybe a little bit of an unpopular opinion. Gen 2. Moving on to Gen 2. This is the best true role-playing experience of the franchise, and that, in my mind, is what makes Gen 2 so special. It has unique slice-of-life gameplay that is kind of not found in any other Pokemon game. And the reason for this is that there's so much gameplay based around the daily events and real game clock, which was new to the game at the time. It's a very core thematic pillar of the game, the progression of time, and so it ends up being kind of a very cozy and inhabitable RPG. The only other game in the series that has really even attempted to do it this way is the remake of Johto in Gen 4. And in my mind, the things that Gen 2 brought to the table are kind of also in their purest form here, where there's breeding, but there isn't IVs and natures. I mean, there's DVs, but they really don't matter that much. So anything that you breed will be good. You don't have the problem that you run into in later gens where there's such a wide gap between what is viable to use and what is suboptimal in terms of breeding and raising Pokemon that, like, say you get a shiny Ho-Oh in Gen 3, but its nature is wrong. It's gonna sort of cheapen the experience a bit versus getting a shiny Ho-Oh in Gen 2. You're like, sweet, I have a shiny Ho-Oh. For that reason, I find it also very approachable. It's fun to put together teams. There's no bittersweetness to it there. It's just all sweet. And even without having the expanded Pokemon building elements that show up later in the series, I find that Pokemon are still distinguishable as individuals from each other, even with just DVs. Moving on to Generation 3, I'm really blazing through these. I may have to go back and kind of fill these out a bit more. For me, Hoenn as a region is what makes Gen 3 special. It's a very lovable region. It stands out, in my opinion, from other Pokemon regions, has a lot of interesting locations and variety in the landscape, and it's designed deliberately to have very explorable, off-the-beaten-path routes that you don't have any real reason to go to, but if you do explore them, you'll find lots of items and trainers. And it feels in that way like the things that you find are very special and secret. There's the Reggies, obviously, which are probably the most secretive quest line in a Pokemon game to date. There are so many layers of cryptic puzzles to solve. Of course, it was the originator of the formula of the game centering around the legendary Pokemon in Gens 1 and 2. The storyline really focused on Team Rocket and overthrowing them or thwarting their plans for just doing bad stuff without necessarily a big climax with super high stakes like saving the world or catching a legendary Pokemon. The legendaries were treated as those extra little puzzles and secret rewards that you could get after you've beaten the game. In Gen 3, the legendaries become part of the storyline, and this is really the first time that you're able to catch the main box legendary, I suppose, before you've beaten the game. I think. I have to replay Gen 2 and double check. I don't remember if you can get Ho-Oh and Lugia before you beat the game in Gen 2, like in Gold and Silver. I know in Crystal you can get Suicune before you beat the game. Anyway, perhaps that's not... I'm getting a little off topic. What I mean is the legendaries are part of the story for the first time. That is now sort of a cliche. It's now expected and is selling point of the game that you will get a legendary and use it for the big climax in the game. I felt that this first iteration of that idea was actually the best they've ever done it, and that future games have not been as satisfying to me, and not really as coherent and cohesive a narrative as Gen 3's. Not only that, but all aspects of the gameplay in Ruby and Sapphire are sort of in service of the themes and the message of the game, and it makes it very cohesive. It's a well-designed game in that way. Another thing that makes Gen 3 very unique is that it is the most annoying to complete to this day. It's so large, spanning so many different games and consoles, and it's so uncompromising in requiring you to put in a lot of time and energy and money. It's very expensive. It's a test of patience and skill and commitment, and also a test of your bank account. For better or worse, I think until recently this was the biggest generation, and it's very ambitious. It's almost ahead of its time and how connected everything was before wireless technology was widespread and very accessible. Now, I don't think this is necessarily something that I consider a strength, like the way that it was all executed, but it does have quite a massive scope. And I think if you wanted a project that's going to take you years and years and years to finish, you can get a lot out of Gen 3. Moving on to Gen 4, what made Gen 4 special for me at the time that it came out was it was the first gen that had Wi-Fi connection capability. It really brought the whole world together in playing Pokemon. A lot of the multiplayer features in Gen 3 were basically totally inaccessible to anyone outside of Japan or outside of a community that they lived in that was very dense, I should say. Like, if you lived in a suburb, you really couldn't get the most out of Gen 3. But now that Wi-Fi was here, that was no longer a barrier. And that's really the defining characteristic of Gen 4, I think. And it kept a lot of the bigness of Gen 3. The Battle Frontier is still there. A lot of those features are still there. But now they're much more accessible. Or they were at the time. I think there's ways you can preserve the online connectivity aspects of Gen 4 even today. But at the time, it was a big relief to not have trade restrictions and to be able to go online and get anything I was missing without buying another game. So another special thing about Gen 4 is the physical special split. In Gen 3, they introduced a lot of those elements that added some depth to Pokemon and really made them very specialized at doing one specific thing. But a lot of Pokemon were sort of stuck at that point with stats that didn't really coincide with the move sets that they had in terms of physical and special moves because of the typing being tied to whether they were physical or special. Now, in Gen 4, any Pokemon could use both physical and special moves, and that allowed them to use moves of various types in various ways. The biggest example is, like in Gen 2, you wouldn't want to put the elemental punches on a fighting type necessarily. You would want to put them on a special type, like a psychic user, for example, because they would have higher special and make better use of them based on the types that those moves were. But now that the punches were physical, a fighting type could make use of them. I also think that Gen 4, the level scaling of the main series is quite high compared to past gens. I know Gen 5 is the absolute peak of this, but Gen 5 has a totally different leveling system where it's actually easier to reach higher levels in late game. But Gen 4 scales pretty high and is really quite difficult. Like, the main series games in Gen 4 have high difficulty just to beat the game. And I think that that's really the only gen where that's true. And it felt like the peak of Pokemon growing up with its audience. And of course, Gen 4 also spawned a whole new generation of Pokemon fans. Basically, all of the content creators that are active today started in Gen 4. They're all adult Gen Z who grew up with Diamond and Pearl and Heart and Gold and Soul Silver. I think that's also the majority of the audience who watches Pokemon videos now, which is very strange to think about. In Gen 5, what makes Gen 5 special to me is that it's the most fun. The gameplay, like the core blocks of putting Pokemon together and building movesets and then using Pokemon in different ways. Gen 5 is the best version of that has ever existed in the series. And not only that, Gen 5 has a large post-game that actually gives you stuff to do with the Pokemon that you raise. Gen 5 also has amazingly detailed sprites and a really great, I think all the routes are very well designed to be explored. And I think it's the first generation where each M use was no longer locked behind badges, which meant that you had options for sort of non-linear exploration of a very linear region. Also, the reason that it is so fun to build Pokemon in Gen 4 is because TMs are no longer single use. I talk about Gen 4 being the most difficult gen. Not only were TMs single use, but the coins that you needed at the game corner to get the best TMs you needed a lot of coins. It was very, very harsh. I really feel like Gen 5 is kind of like the last hurrah of 2D Pokemon games and the last hurrah of a big post-game in Pokemon games. Now we get DLC. It's kind of come back in a way, but big post-game facilities like the ones we got in Gen 5 have never really returned. And Gen 5 is kind of an experiment with what Pokemon stories could be. It was the first Pokemon game that was based outside of Japan, and although the region may have been inspired by parts of the US, I sort of feel like it's not very specific to the actual US. Like, it doesn't feel like a region based on places you can actually go and see those things. You can see things that look kind of like them all over, but really Gen 5 story is kind of the most Dragon Quest-y Pokemon has ever been. There's a castle and a dragon and a king. Yeah, it's a very different kind of story for a Pokemon game. So yeah, it was kind of based on America, like aesthetically, but the story was not inherently American, and that was a big shift for Pokemon games in general, because they, from that point on, were all sort of like that, where they took place in a region inspired by a country, but the stories were not inherently about that country the way that the stories about Tokyo were really about Tokyo, and the stories about Kyushu were really about Kyushu. Gen 6 was the first 3D Pokemon game, and it was also the first globally released Pokemon game. Up until that point, games would come out in Japan first, and there would be a period of about a year or so, but while the games were translated and localized into different languages, that they would come out later in the US and around the world. In Gen 6, the games came out in every language all at once, and I think that that is partially why the development of Pokemon games is so different from that point on. I feel like that, in many ways, increases the workload for what has to be ready when the games come out, and so they're sort of built with that in mind, and the scope is much more limited. Well, I would say that the scope is actually more ambitious now, but what they can do is more limited, so they have to sort of either be an unsatisfying version of something or fall just short of their potential. So this is, I'm trying to talk about what makes a gen special, but that sounds very critical. So reeling it back in, Gen 6 for me was really special because it was the beginning of Pokemon content creation on a larger scale on the internet, and it connected me to so many people. The idea that you would play Pokemon alone was really a thing of the past at that point. There was always somebody to talk to about it, and a lot of fun discussion happening with a lot of passionate fans. The other thing that's really unique about Gen 6 is the introduction of Mega Pokemon. It was the first real battle gimmick that we got that changed sort of how the flow of battles went, and sort of jumping off of that point, it was the start of the wide adoption of the doubles format in competitive Pokemon. So up until that point, I would say in Gens 4 and 5, and even in Gen 3, back when people used to use simulators primarily like Shoddy Battle, the main format people used for the metagame was singles, either 6v6 or 3v3. And the doubles format for VGC was a thing, like officially, since Gen 3, but it wasn't as popular as singles until Gen 6, and I think a lot of that has to do with the growing interest in Pokemon content and the streaming of organized play Pokemon events. People actually saw that you could participate in VGC, and in many ways I think doubles is much more accessible than singles, and with the introduction of Battle Spot in the games themselves, maybe Battle Spot was in Gen 4 and 5 and I just didn't know, but it seemed like Battle Spot really popularized doubles with more people. Now, don't crucify me if I'm wrong about any of that. I am not a competitive player. So this is really just an observation from the standpoint of what people talk about in terms of Pokemon these days and what the focus is. Like, for example, when I would make my top 10 lists, competitive Pokemon would just come up a lot because when you're comparing Pokemon, one of the ways that you can compare their use is through how they're used in the metagame. Because really you can make any Pokemon work for single player, unless you're thinking about like a top 10 Pokemon for Pokemon Stadium specifically or for the Battle Frontier specifically, you're gonna really be able to make most anything work. So in my mind, the main basis of comparison for Pokemon was how they're used in the metagame, how often they're used, by whom, and for what purpose, etc. So most of my videos I used to talk about singles format metagame a lot. And now when I post shorts of my old videos, a lot of the comments are like, nobody plays singles. Why is she talking about singles? Because it was the most popular format at the time. And now it's not. I think Gen 6 was kind of the start of the adoption of doubles. And finally, Amiibo features were introduced in 6, where you have some kind of like one-on-one interaction with your Pokemon buddies, and ever since then there has been some kind of bonding feature where you can do something with your Pokemon as companions other than battle. Either having a Pokemon follow you, or having a camp with your Pokemon, or feeding them, or whatever. That evolves over time as well, but Amiibo is really where that all began, where it all started. It was a new mechanical reality, the companion side of having Pokemon. Gen 7. So I think Gen 7 was a very experimental generation, ultimately. A lot of the games between, I guess, like basically from Gen 6 onwards, the games started evolving pretty rapidly, where each game would have another little step towards what they are now, which is a free roaming open world kind of game, as opposed to a linear 2D JRPG. So in Gen 6, they introduced the 3D elements. In Gen 7, they started experimenting a lot with the formulas of the game. For example, there were boss battles in the form of totem Pokemon introduced that were a different style of battle, and these would sort of be continued on in the form of raids and carried throughout the series, but they became more of like a multiplayer feature at that point. Additionally, Gen 7 did away with 8 gems, which was a really big leap. Instead, we had ride Pokemon, and they did away with the gym challenge, and that they replaced it with other types of challenges throughout the game instead of having each gym battle be just a battle. So, on top of that, although it does have a story with the legendary Pokemon and the stakes are saving the world, it is a much smaller, more intimate, character-driven story. And there's more cutscenes, like a lot more cutscenes in Gen 7. So the story becomes a major focus of the game. And I think, really, Gen 7 also continued the battle gimmick in the form of Mega Pokemon. Well, Megas were not in Gen 7, instead we had Z moves, which were a gimmick that, instead of applying to just a handful of Pokemon, could be applied uniformly across all Pokemon, as was the case later with Dynamax and so on, terastallizing and all that. So it was sort of an evolution of the concept where instead of just having some Pokemon being able to use this gimmick, it became that it was part of every battle and every Pokemon would get to use it. Additionally, they introduced Ultra Beasts, which sort of started a category of Pokemon in each game that were kind of like special in some way. Like, there were Ultra Beasts in Gen 7. In Gen 9, there were the Paradox Pokemon. I'm drawing a blank on what was in Gen 8, but that kind of has carried over. Now I have to check. I feel stupid. You know, I had it in my head that every gen had something like that, but I'm actually looking at the Gen 8 Pokedex. I don't actually see an equivalent from Gen 8. So maybe that was just a special thing Gen 7 and Gen 9 did. But really, I think Gen 7 was the first time in Pokemon's history that they ever had like a real competitor in terms of another popular monster collecting game, which was not a Smash Global hit, but in Japan, Yokai Watch was very, very popular. And as a result, they had to innovate quite a bit. And I think that was really the start of Pokemon just sort of moving away from the linear JRPG story that they've been doing and basically the JRPG mechanics. It became a much more action RPG type series as time went on. So Gen 8. Gen 8 was the very beginning of open world. It wasn't an open world game, but it had the wild area, which was an open world concept. It's an enormous generation with a metric ton of games. So there's Sword and Shield, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which some people argue is Gen 7 and not Gen 8, but it's on the Switch. There's Legends Arceus, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I don't think I'm forgetting anything, but that's a lot of games. So all of these games included raid battles. This is the first set of Pokemon games that came out after Pokemon Go, and because Pokemon Go was so popular, the raid idea of raid battles from Pokemon Go kind of transferred over to the main series. Along with that, the Pokeball Plus in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee that allowed you to carry a Pokemon around with you in a little peripheral. It was an auto catch in Pokemon Go as well. And really, I think what stood out to me about Gen 8 the most is that it was a real shift into a gameplay style where you're encouraged to swap Pokemon a lot all in the same playthrough. So the game becomes ridiculously easy if you keep a team of 6 because they throw lots of ways to level at you so that you can have any Pokemon in your party at any point and catch them up extremely quickly to the rest of your team. They do this with the candies, like the small, extra small, medium, large, and extra large candies for experience that you can get just from doing raids. So if you get a lot of candies, you can basically just press a button and your latest catch will be at the same level as the rest of your team. And I think they did this primarily because people were playing the old Pokemon games that way. Like, people were not replaying them with different teams like I was. People were mostly trying to use their favorite Pokemon in the playthrough when they got them. So people were trying to add Mischievous to their team at Mount Silver and were frustrated that it was much lower level than the rest of their team. So instead of forcing you to save some Pokemon for repeated playthroughs and like trade them to other games and things like that, now the series is like, fine, you can use whatever you want whenever you want. We're not going to even have friction. Just swap them out all the time. And if you don't, you'll be over-leveled and bored, so you're going to want to swap them out. That was the big special change that really started in Gen 8. I would say it was moving towards that in Gen 6 and 7 with the EXP share, but it really, really became a thing in Gen 8 with the raids and the candies that you could get. So I had asked my friends if they had anything special about Gen 8 that they wanted to bring up, and they mentioned that the food making mechanic was introduced in Gen 8, sort of replacing a me, but it stuck around, and it was the most involved, supposedly, in Gen 8. I will admit, I didn't finish Sword and Shield. I still have not to this day, so it's kind of hard for me to comment on that specifically, but it's really hard to say what is uniquely special about Gen 8 because it is so many games. It's just a lot of games, I will say. I guess technically, Gen 8 also introduced overworld Pokemon encounters, and that is not limited to the wild area. You could see them in the overworld even just in the normal routes. And this was true in Sword and Shield and in Let's Go. And then, if you want to get really into it, I think Legends Arceus was the most special thing about Gen 8 because it was a totally different genre of game. It was the first real action RPG in Pokemon. And I think that was the basis for where things would be going from then on into Gen 9. So now in Gen 9, it's sort of hard to say what's special about it because who knows how big it'll be? Gen 8 was huge, so they could just keep making Gen 9 games. And it'll be hard to say until we're finished into Gen 10 what the most special part about it was. So far, now that Pokemon Champions is on the horizon, it seems like Pokemon is really free to fully indulge in the action RPG battle system ideas without jeopardizing Pokemon the esport. That can kind of now exist totally separately from the main series games, which allows for kind of a fun new metagame of people figuring out how to do well in this kind of more casual, real-time battle system that exists in Legends ZA. What makes Scarlet and Violet kind of the most special, I think, was that the storytelling was really peak in that game. I think Legends Arceus had a pretty good story, but I think Scarlet and Violet is really the best a Pokemon story has been since Gen 3. Yeah, it's high praise, but I think it deserves it. And it's sort of a shame because people really don't give Scarlet and Violet the chance because it was released in an unfinished state. Like, you can tell that they put love into the game because in order to tell a story like that, you kind of have to. But I think the pandemic really impacted the development of the game, and people are not willing to look past that. And people are very angry at Pokemon for changing so much from Gen 8 onward and for not having the national dex anymore. I think a lot of the original players are just never really gonna get over that. There's really nothing Pokemon can do to please everyone. And it's sort of a shame that people have, well, and maybe reasonably people have really high expectations for Pokemon because it has been a lot of things to a lot of people. And it is trying now to occupy a space that a lot of games occupy, and a lot of games that have quite a bit more resources and development time put into them occupy this same space, which is the open world exploration genre, real-time RPG. So if it's going to be playing with the big boys in that space, it's going to be compared to them, and I don't think it really can be what people want it to be. Otherwise, it would be. You know what I mean? Either if Pokemon could develop a game that could make everybody happy, I'm sure that they would. But anyway, I still think that there are some things about the modern games worth praising. And for me, that was the story in Scarlet and Violet. And I do like the Legends games because I think that they're the most successful at doing interesting things with the Pokemon genre. There's kind of an argument to be made that because Pokemon, the characters, are so popular, Pokemon is kind of resting on its laurels and not doing everything that it could be, because all some people want is an okay game with the Pokemon characters in it. And so it doesn't have to be truly great. And I see that argument, but I guess it just doesn't feel fair. I don't know. It's not that it's unfair in that people shouldn't have high expectations for Pokemon, but I think it's unfair to assume that Pokemon is just being lazy and that's why it's not living up to what other games can offer at the same scope. Because I can kind of see their point sometimes. Like, I guess with Legends EA, there's just a lot of games that you can directly compare it to and say, like, they were able to do much better things. And really the only reason that I'm having as much fun with this as I am is because I'm using Pokemon. If this was another game that didn't have Pokemon in it, that was doing all the same things that this game is, I probably wouldn't actually like it that much. But I think Pokemon as a brand has pretty lofty aspirations to be like hugely successful in multiple genres. And so I don't think that they want to just coast on their video games. I think they want their video games to be as popular as everything else that they make, with as many demographics as everything else that they make. For me, that's what I see anyway, when I think about their brand efforts and their expansion into lifestyle and the popularity of the TCG and kind of like the character goods divisions of the brand, that they must want the video games to be up there too. They must be trying to figure out how to get all of those people that are into all those other Pokemon products to also be into the Pokemon video games. Because it's kind of a big, untapped group of people. Because I don't think that there's that much crossover between the video game playing audience and those other people. So I don't know. I'm willing to give them a little more grace and think that there must be some pipeline problems that are preventing it from really competing in the same way as other video games in the modern day. But that's kind of true of a lot of like legacy series. So I think that gets through all of my notes. Going into December, I have written the next main channel video. So my plan for December is to actually get a main channel video edited and up. My editor already has all the footage. I just need to record the voiceover. So I'm hoping next weekend I'll finalize the script, record the voiceover or any on-camera parts, assuming I can be on camera, I'm feeling better. And then I'll have a main channel video for December. I have had to sort of rethink things in a more realistic way recently, so I'm not sure going into the new year. I was thinking I would have a set number of bonus videos that I'm going to be making for the year and have those scheduled on specific months so that I can have the submission process kind of like go through a few months. And in that way, I won't be scaling back the kinds of rewards I'm offering, just the frequency. Because I've been doing monthly bonus videos for over a year now. I think actually, maybe I've been doing them for 2 years now. And they served me well for 2 years. It's been fun to do them, but I would like to do them less often to kind of give my brain more of a break. I know I always am talking about how much I need a break, and then I'm never giving myself one, or nothing I do seems to be enough of a break to recover from everything else going on, but I gotta try something, so I'm gonna try fewer bonus videos next year. And with the goal that I'll be able to write more, ultimately. That I will have more than one day a month to write, despite anything else that'll be going on, because if it's not one thing, it's another. Like, I was volunteering twice this year, then I had IOP for 3 months that was taking up like 15 hours a week, and sometimes it just happens that I have other commitments. Even if I'm not going out of my way to do them, it ends up happening. So this will give me a little bit more flexibility to be having other stuff going on and still writing and making stuff that I care about making. That's the goal. So December will be another monthly bonus video. And then January will be the start of the new year, and I will post a calendar with the expected dates that I will be making bonus videos and sort of work out a new way to take submissions for new pledges in those categories. So suppose somebody pledges to suggest a topic and then they have to drop the pledge before the video is made. They will have some idea of when that video will be coming out so they can then re-pledge to see that video, is my hope. And I have a massive backlog of the last 2 years of bonus videos to put up on YouTube, so I think I'll still be able to put up monthly bonus videos over there. They're just going to be the same ones that have already been on Patreon. So yeah, I've been recording for a little under an hour now, so I think that'll be a good 20-minute bonus video. I'm really enjoying the new Kirby Air Ride. Let me know if you have any suggestions of custom machines that you would like to see in the game, because I'm trying to devise a way to come up with more of the Mile Shop points so that I can buy the really expensive Hatsune Miku paper star that somebody made. And I think to earn that many, I'm gonna have to come up with a very popular vehicle idea that a lot of people want to buy. So I should do evolution vehicles. That'll be popular. That's a good idea. Also, this might look just slightly different. I moved my computer over about 2 feet. That's it. That's the only difference. My hope is that I will have the space now in this room to put some kind of small couch so that I can actually comfortably play games at this TV. I've had this wonderful setup for years, and it's still really hard to play video games in here because I don't have a couch. So yeah, I think that's everything. Hope you guys are having a good winter so far. Fall/winter. Oh my god, this year has felt like an eternity. I hope the following year is a better one. I'll see you in December. Bye!